Ah, the Renaissance. The Dark Ages were over and everybody was smart again, as the story goes. Really, it was as it says on the label, a rebirth of classical knowledge. As historians of rhetoric, Bizel and Herzberg put it, the intellectual movement called humanism emphasized human powers to know and change the world, and insisted on scholars' rights to pursue knowledge without being constrained by church dogma. The humanists directed attention to classical Greek and Roman learning and developed new approaches to studying literature, history, and science. During this period, rhetoric, in a variety of forms, was a central focus. And that makes sense. As we saw when we talked about the Greek and Roman worlds, rhetoric was a central focus of social, political, and educational life. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when Renaissance scholars started reading Cicero again, that rhetoric charged back to the foreground as well. And it really did show up everywhere. Agricola published a translation of the Progymnasmata of Aphthonius, and the ancient rhetorical curriculum became standard fare in Renaissance education. The Italian humanists saw rhetoric as a means for expressing knowledge convincingly. The Jesuits followed suit and taught the 5 classical canons of rhetoric to prepare their students. Even Machiavelli wrote that rhetoric could moderate tyrants, because even the most brutal strongman could not rule by force alone. Persuasion was needed in order to get the public to accept his ideas. And even boundaries that we tend to hold, like the ones separating poetry from rhetoric, were not enforced during the Renaissance. So truly, to say that the Renaissance ran on rhetoric is hardly an exaggeration. Because of that, there are so many people and places and threads that we could pick up and follow, so rather than provide an exhaustive overview of all the rhetorical developments of the age, I'd like to tell the story of Renaissance rhetoric as the story of the enduring debate about rhetoric's value. In the ancient world, we saw Plato accuse rhetoric of being a dangerous counterfeit of philosophy. In the medieval age, scholastic philosophy rather than rhetoric was the primary mode of academic thought, and when we get to the Renaissance, we again see the pressures of philosophy and eventually science on rhetoric's place in the world. Really, the debate about rhetoric comes down to 2 worldviews, which, in his book, The Motives of Eloquence, Literary Rhetoric in the Renaissance, Richard Lanham calls the serious worldview and the rhetorical. The serious paradigm he describes like this: every man possesses a central self, an irreducible identity. These selves combine into a society, which in turn is contained in a physical nature independent of man. Man has invented language to communicate with his fellow man. He communicates facts and concepts about both nature and society. He can also communicate a third category of response, emotions. When he is communicating facts or concepts, the success with which they are communicated is measured by something we call clarity. When he is communicating feelings, success is measured by something we call sincerity. In other words, people have distinct concrete identities. You are you, fundamentally, and I am me, fundamentally.
More like bored-mentally, am I right?
Wow, really good one, bud.
You're being sarcastic, but I know it is. Just keep on boring the people, bud.
Yeah, maybe I will. Anyway, yourself is a fixed quantity, and outside yourself, you have a concrete reality that is fixed and independent of you. Meaning, regardless of your personal preference, the Earth orbits the Sun, electrons have a negative charge, and whales are mammals. Because of that, so the serious argument goes, language works best when it transparently communicates facts about the world and about your irreducible self. You wouldn't want to cloud a discussion of the facts of the world with words that might misconstrue your intent or add layers of misleading emotion, and you wouldn't want to discuss your own feelings with anything other than straightforward sincerity, right? We'll talk more about the serious worldview as we go, but in a lot of ways it probably sounds pretty familiar. Plato was uncomfortable with the sophists because they just didn't seem attached to the same kind of serious truth that he was. Modern science has developed whole vocabularies to refer transparently and directly to mitochondria, main sequence stars, metatarsals, and antiprotons. And on the personal level, you're supposed to be true to yourself. To the serious mind, being performative is a high crime indeed. But contrast that with the rhetorical view as Lanham describes it. The rhetorical view of life, then, begins with the centrality of language. It conceives reality as fundamentally dramatic, man as fundamentally a role player. We play for advantage, but we play for pleasure too. Rhetoric is always ritualizing, stylizing purpose in order to enjoy it more. Rhetoric provided a training in the mechanisms of identity, offered a selection of roles the adolescent could try out. It offered a training in tolerance, if by that we mean getting inside another's skull and looking out. It offered the friendliest of advices on how to tap into any and all sources of pleasure. It habituated its students to a world of contingent purpose, of perpetual cognitive dissonance, plural orchestration. It specialized less in knowledge than in the way knowledge is held. And if you've been with us from the beginning of the series, well, then this worldview probably doesn't seem too scandalous. Sure, you can probably see why an approach to life that prioritized linguistic and social role-playing might trouble those who insist on absolute realities that are independent of our social world, but since Greece and through to the Renaissance, we've seen the value of rhetoric and this rhetorical worldview. Obviously, the rhetorical worldview is not a worldview that denies truth, but where the ancient philosophers were interested in ascertaining absolute truth, the ancient rhetoricians were more interested in talking about what we did with truth. Where the serious worldview would condemn someone for being performative, the rhetorical worldview would ask, what other choice do you have? Take the Roman teacher Quintilian. As Lanham points out, Quintilian taught that we can learn noble sentiment by speaking nobly. Performative nobility becomes genuine nobility. Expression, Lanham says, sustains the self. But this is all a little theoretical, so let's turn our attention to everyone's favorite Renaissance writer, William Shakespeare. More specifically, let's begin by looking at Hamlet. In his reading, Lanham argues that Hamlet is really two plays in one. We have the serious, expected tragedy played out by Laertes, who does everything a tragic hero is supposed to do. But then we have the play about Hamlet. Lanham writes, as several of its students have pointed out, it is a wordy play. Eloquence haunts it. Horatio starts with wordiness by supplying a footnote from ancient Rome in the first scene, by improving the occasion with informative reflection. Everybody laughs at Polonius for his moralizing glosses, but Hamlet is just as bad, worse. Gertrude asks him in the second scene why he grieves to excess, and he gives us a disquisition on seeming and reality in grief. The king follows with his bravura piece on grief. Everybody moralizes the pageant. The Hamlet play abounds with triggers for straight revenge tragedy response. The whole mystery of Hamlet's hesitant revenge boils down to wondering why he doesn't go ahead and play his traditional part, complete with the elegant rants we know he can deliver. The question, Lanham argues, is not what Hamlet's motive is, but what kind of motive, serious or rhetorical. Why can't he act? Polonius, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern, Laertes, Claudius all go to it, but Hamlet never breaks through to reality. His motives and his behavior remain dramatic from first to last. So in spite of all those bodies at the end, commentators wonder if Hamlet amounts to tragedy, and if so, what kind. Hamlet lacks the serious central self tragedy requires. We are compelled to stand back, hold off our identification, and hence to locate the play within rhetorical coordinates, a tragicomedy about the two kinds of self and the two kinds of motive. That is, while Laertes goes on the revenge plot and plays the role of the tragic hero, Hamlet talks about things, dramatizes everything, and in the end is less a centralized, irreducible person and more a character who is constantly performing or playing it up. You might be tempted to see that as inauthenticity. But Lanham argues that it is really complexity. The simple, serious self may be real, but it's not all there is. There's also the performative, rhetorical self that's always there, and you don't get closer to truth by bracketing it. You get closer to truth by reckoning with it. Thus, Lanham argues that Shakespeare's writing typifies the stylistic strategy of the Renaissance as a whole. Human flesh, he writes, is sullied with self-consciousness, with theatricality. And these will be the ground for whatever authentic morality any of us can muster. But it's not just Hamlet. Lanham also argues that Shakespeare's sonnets reveal a similar awareness of the tensions between the serious and the rhetorical. In his reading of Sonnet 116, Lanham says, read as a serious poem, it argues that the star, love, is a necessary assumption if the world is to make any sense. We must start with some commitment. Why not call it love? I love, therefore I am. Read within rhetorical coordinates, it says that all you really start with is the act of writing. I write, therefore I am. The poem is about the relation between the two poetics. A poem about defining essence, the marriage of true minds, it yet leans on its words in such a way, varying their sense with repetition, that essence dwells first in words. So the serious view says that love exists somewhere out there and independent of us. The rhetorical view says love only exists once we start performing it, once we start writing about it. Do you love first, or do you perform love first? Lanham argues that Sonnet 116 deals with both, wrestles with the tensions in both. It asserts love, but it does so by performing it. To read Shakespeare with only your serious eyes would be to misread him, to miss all the rhetorical play and performative self-consciousness that is built into the rhetorical worldview. You get, in other words, only half the poem if you miss the rhetoric of it. And across the sonnets, we get an array of different ideas, voices, assertions, and identities. A serious critic might try to pin down a single Shakespeare that runs consistently through all of them, to force the sonnets to tell a cohesive story. But Lanham points out, a story means a plot, and a plot demands a consistent self, for sonneteer at least, which the sonnets, in their multiple tergiversations, take pains to deny. So if, by the time you get to sonnet 116, you think that its assertions about love are at odds with what the other sonnets have said, you might be tempted to think that someone else wrote them. No problem, Lanham writes, 115 other eyes, at least, stand ready. If the sonneteer wants to bring his selves together, he also enjoys leaving them apart, role-playing for its own sake. Again, Shakespeare has it both ways. So if Renaissance rhetoric was all about language and about the performance of roles and the realization that we're all performing different roles at different times, that provides a ground for tolerance and an ability to weigh knowledge against a given situation and then apply that knowledge in fitting ways, then Shakespeare's dramatic characters, or apparently inconsistent sonnets, are not bugs, but features. What stymies the serious critic is natural and reasonable to the rhetorical one. That is, language is not just a tool for expressing yourself, it's also the means of creating yourself. And that idea permeated the Renaissance. We've talked at length in another video about Erasmus's Decopia, which Bizel and Herzberg point out seems to encourage a sort of superabundant verbal play that is designed to increase fluency of both words and ideas. And Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, which may be responsible for our modern version of the Renaissance man, describes one who performs classical virtues, someone who is wise, honest, skilled in conversation, able to write prose and poetry, someone who's well read in ancient literature, and so on. As Bizel and Herzberg note, he wears carefully crafted masks that help him to improve his character. He is always on stage, always carefully monitoring how his performance is affecting his audience, the people around him. All that performativity would make the serious mind sick. You should have good character, not wear a mask of good character, but the rhetorical argument would be that by wearing the mask, you adopt the character. It would be like condemning the student for having to learn how to play the violin by practicing it, rather than just being a violinist from the authentic start. Practice is so performative. And of course, none of this was new to the Renaissance. Cicero described an ideal orator with a broad education, and Quintilian devised a lifelong curriculum for raising orators who were skilled speakers and who had good characters. You become by performing. And besides, an inauthentic actor could only keep up the charade for so long. But for as much as the Renaissance was characterized by this resurgence of rhetorical knowledge and the ideas about language and identity that came with it, not everyone was such a fan. Peter Ramus, for example, made a name for himself by writing withering critiques of Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian. Far more serious in his approach, Ramus argued that philosophy and rhetoric needed to be held in their proper places, which really meant that all of the knowledge-generating abilities that rhetoric had traditionally had were actually the domain of philosophy. But in his argument against Quintilian, he makes his complaint clear. When we talked about Quintilian earlier in the series, we mentioned his definition of the orator, the good man speaking well. To that, Ramus says, "What then can be said against this definition of an orator? I assert indeed that such a definition of an orator seems to me to be useless and stupid." Why? Because a definition of any artist, which covers more than is included in the rules of his art, is superfluous and defective. Ramus then complains that Quintilian includes all the canons of rhetoric, invention, arrangement, style, delivery, in his discussion of judgment, and says that by doing that, Quintilian reveals himself to be quite ignorant of dialectic, for he has either not heard or not read anything about the role of judging and about the many types of syllogisms, both simple and complex. And sure, a part of me kind of likes Ramus's burn-it-all-down approach to scholarship.
Wow, that might be the first reasonable thing you've ever said, bud.
Well, what can I say? Maybe you're rubbing off on me.
One could hope, bud. One could hope.
But as much as I like that attitude, Ramus is pretty insufferable to read. He's like the worst kind of YouTube commenter. You know, the kind that half listens to your argument, misunderstands your purpose, and then complains that you're not talking about things in accordance with his own personal worldview. Sure, Quintilian may be doing something methodologically undisciplined by including good character in his definition of an orator. If oratory is about speaking, then the definition probably should only include aspects of speaking, not aspects of character. On that front, Ramus's critique is reasonable. But Quintilian isn't doing philosophy. He's building a curriculum for students of rhetoric, and he's making it clear that training orators requires education in oratorical skill and good character building. So sure, maybe from a serious philosophical perspective, maybe Quintilian's definition is, quote, useless and stupid. But from the perspective of outlining the priorities of an educational method, it's really not a problem at all. And yeah, maybe Quintilian isn't spending a lot of time talking about syllogisms, but Pete, we've been through this. I know you have your grievances with Aristotle, but Aristotle said that while philosophical dialectic works on the basis of the syllogism, rhetoric works on the enthymeme. So why get mad at Quintilian for playing by the rules of his own game instead of the one that you want him to play? There can be more than one framework, sir. Are we really going to retread the tired ground of rhetoric just being bad philosophy? Well, it seems so, and unfortunately for us all, Ramus's work was really influential in England, and his efforts to strip rhetoric of all its tools except for style would have lasting effects. As Bazell and Herzberg write, style for Ramus seems to be a kind of applied psychology, a study of the way to frame sentences so as to force certain reactions from recalcitrant, mentally inferior audiences. One is allowed to multiply tropes and figures for poetic enjoyment, and many Ramist rhetoric texts do just that. However, for serious business, a plain style is best. A supposedly unornamented style was elevated further in religion by the Puritans and in academia by proponents of the new science. So again, we see the conflict between the rhetorical and the serious. Quintilian left too much play in his definition for the serious Ramus. Rhetoric per Ramus has nothing to say about judgments or truth and is only for making pretty sentences. Now, obviously, I'm making it clear how I feel about it, but the larger points remain. The serious worldview seems to prevail. But why? Perhaps, Lanham writes, the serious premises have thrived because they flatter us. The rhetorical view does not. The concept of a central self, true or not, flatters man immensely. It gives him an identity outside time and change that he sees nowhere else in the sublunary universe. So, too, the theory of knowledge upon which seriousness rests. How flattering that we, at whatever brave cost to ourselves, penetrate to the way things are. Look, at the end of our quest upon the true face of beauty. How humiliating to be all this time only looking in a mirror. Indeed, Lanham argues rhetoric's real crime, one is often led to suspect, is its candid acknowledgement of the rhetorical aspects of serious life. So where is the intellectual integrity of philosophy if all the world's a stage? How important is science if it is only equipped to derive facts about the world but is powerless to tell us what to do with those facts? And when rhetoric points out that scientists are not vessels of absolute truth, but are just reviewer two who raises a stink about your methods section to prevent the publication of your findings over their own, well, it makes science seem like an awfully human endeavor instead of the serious, absolute quest for knowledge that it wants to be. And to serious ears, what I just said probably sounds like an attack on science. But to rhetorical ears, it's just an acknowledgement of how things really are, and you need both, the serious and the rhetorical. But it's the serious ones who keep insisting on only needing one, and rhetoric always seems to get the bad end of that deal. But speaking of science, while rhetoric had already had a long history of persisting despite philosophical attacks, by the end of the Renaissance, science was stepping onto the scene with its own serious premises. The Royal Society, for example, advocated for a plain style in scientific writing, which was a sharp contrast to the stylistic abundance of the early Renaissance. And whatever their initial intent, the legacy of that decision has been a preference for the recognizably dry prose of serious scholarship. You might get the feeling that to play with language is to be an intellectual lightweight. That said, as we bring the Renaissance to its close, let's turn to Francis Bacon, whose work was influential in the rise of science and who happily had a more moderate stance towards rhetoric. While Bacon acknowledges that Plato was right to hate the rhetoricians of his time, he argues that Plato was wrong to write off rhetoric as an art entirely, going on to say, "Logic handleth reason exact and in truth, and rhetoric handleth it as it is planted in popular opinions and manners. And therefore Aristotle doth wisely place rhetoric as between logic on the one side and moral or civil knowledge on the other, as participating of both. For the proofs and demonstrations of logic are toward all men indifferent and the same, but the proofs and persuasions of rhetoric ought to differ according to the auditors. Famously, Bacon wrote, "The duty and office of rhetoric is to apply reason to imagination for the better moving of the will." That is, as Lanham argues, you need both reason, facts, the truths of the serious domain, as well as the rhetorical. Facts by themselves do not inspire everyone to take action. Rhetoric takes those facts, reason, and applies them to the imagination in order to motivate action. In some ways, the Renaissance feels like a rerun of the debates that roiled about rhetoric in ancient Greece, and that's understandable. Rhetoric wasn't new, but it was renewed in the Renaissance as people turned their attention back to the speeches and letters of classical figures like Cicero. After rhetoric's suppressed presence in the Middle Ages, its resurgence in the Renaissance brought a renewed need to figure out where it fit. For much of the Renaissance, its place was unquestioned, and it consequently formed the foundation of education, literature, politics, and more. In too many ways to account for here, rhetoric was at the heart of the Renaissance because it was at the heart of the Greek and Roman worlds. But just as rhetoric's domain was chipped away before, by the end of the Renaissance, the prevailing view was that rhetoric was an art of style and delivery, and not the broader method for discovering contingent truths and making practical decisions through social consensus. So, the Renaissance is an exciting time to talk about, but also kind of a sad one, as the winds, as they always seemed to, turned and left rhetoric with just a remnant of its classical domain.
Oh, boo-hoo. You should see what they did to alchemy. Someday, we will have our revenge.
But as before, the end of the Renaissance is not the end of rhetoric's story. So while we close this chapter for now, I want to thank you for watching and invite you to come back for more when the history of rhetoric continues. Until then, take care.